for the midnight service. And it began at 11 o'clock and it ran at least until midnight, because at midnight, the Christ candle was lit. And we all lit our candles in church. And so one of my strong memories was having that midnight service on Christmas Eve.
That's awesome. Thanks, Bill. Others, it could be a memory or a tradition. It's up to you.
I have a couple, well, kind of traditions, because every year we did them. We always had Christmas breakfast together, and my grandmother would always make homemade pecan rolls and orange rolls. And so she'd always get out of her car at the house with her little basket. You know, I mean, it's just like, you can just picture this, walking into the house with all this great stuff. And it's just such a fond memory. And then another tradition is we also did Christmas Eve every year. And we always went to the later one. So it was the candlelight service. And, you know, you wrapped presents until you went. And it was just something you looked forward to. It was something we did.
Thanks, Barb. And others?
Well,
Go ahead, Cheryl.
I'll share one.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in a farming community. I attended a one-room school. In fact, I believe it was the last one-room school in the state. When it closed, then they were all closed. So there were maybe a dozen, give or take, students any given year. And we were spread out in different grades. There were two people in my grade. And most of the people I was related to, they were like second or third cousins, except there was usually one, maybe two families who were not from our large extended family. But all through December, we memorized plays. We put on at least 2 plays. We sang all of the typical, you know, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," "Silent Night," all of those. And we memorized all of the verses in a public school. And we sang all of those things in the program that was the last day of school before the holidays. And we memorized poems. So I remember memorizing, you know, 4 verses, 6 verses, 8 verses of various poems. I can't remember them now, but that's what occupied all of December, was all of those practices and memorizing things. And then our parents came, and grandparents in some cases. And we did our program for our parents. And it was a really good experience. I can still almost remember multiple verses of the familiar Christmas carols. I need a little help, but they're still in there somewhere. So I would have to say that was a childhood memory that just sticks, and it's so different than what children are experiencing these days, that it always strikes me as something unique. And then as an adult in Durango, I think one of my favorite things to do was to just appreciate the symbolism. I don't know if it was intended this way, but I always took it this way. The luminarias that lined 3rd Avenue for a number of years started pretty much just beyond our church, came past our church, past the Baptist, Episcopal. The Universalists were there at one time, and on down the street, and then around the corner to the Catholic. And it always struck me as such a sign of unity to have all of those churches of various dimensions, denominations connected by the Luminarius. So I would have to say that that's always been very meaningful. And then it dropped away. And now we kind of don't know year to year whether it's going to happen or not. But I still find it to be just a lovely symbol.
I remember, Cheryl, 8-9 years ago, we moved here. It was our first Christmas Eve service here in Durango. And I got here and there wasn't snow on the ground necessarily, but it was snowing on Christmas Eve. And those luminaries were up and I thought, I moved to Narnia. This is amazing. this is just the greatest place ever. It was magical. I concur. Others?
Well, like Cheryl, I kind of have childhood memories and also adulthood memories, but one of my favorite things about Christmas growing up was just when we would decorate the house, because we usually did it all in one day, and it was this whole big thing where we just covered the house in decorations. And it was just one of the times that I felt most connected to my family, and especially my parents. So that was really nice. And then in adulthood now, I've been participating in caroling at the fort every year. And that just makes me so happy every year because we go around and sing to everyone. And in the ed department especially, they are very grateful. So I don't know if y'all have been in the atrium in the ed department, but there's basically this open space and then people can watch from above. So it's really cool during those moments. And I just really feel connected to the campus on those days. So, yeah.
Thanks, Melody. Anyone else, a favorite Christmas memory? Okay, I'm going to move into my next question. I've got 3 questions. And this doesn't have to be too deeply interpersonal or anything. I just am trying to get a feel for what is a general struggle at Christmas for some of us. And I'll go first again since I asked. Oh, Jenny, you were going to go. I saw the wheels turning.
Yeah, I was just going to say, whatever you said, I couldn't understand. I must have had an unstable internet. You got all mechanical voiced.
A struggle at Christmas.
A struggle.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, in a way I have one. What I was going to tell you is one of my most memorable Christmases was when I was a freshman in college, and I made the decision that I was going to go spend Christmas with I called her Nana, my father's mother. It's in a way a struggle in that I felt kind of estranged from my parents. And so I wanted to be, it was a dual purpose there. I didn't want to be with them, and it was really special to be with my Nana. So I remember sitting and we had TV trays, and so we could eat and watch TV, which my mom never would allow at our house. And we watched special like Lawrence Welk for Christmas. And I was crocheting a doily that was my Christmas gift to her, and I had to keep going so I'd have it finished by Christmas. I made it too.
Good. That's awesome, Jenny. Yeah, that is, family is a struggle.
Family's a struggle.
I shared last week in fellowship, I think. We have two big struggles. I have two big struggles at Christmas. One is we've never once sent out a Christmas card ever to anybody. I mean, we send it like cards to family and stuff, but you know, like the Christmas card that you send to everybody you know, we've never done that because we can't get it together enough in this season to actually do that. And then we say, well, we'll send like a New Year's card, but we never have done that either. So that's one struggle that's fairly superficial. I mean, I feel kind of bad, but I enjoy getting all the cards and putting them up on the refrigerator. And so I wish that I was like participating in that more. But the other being family, and I think I shared in fellowship, maybe I shared it in the sermon, but I doubt it. No, I'm not a real big, I was never a big Christmas person until I had kids. And my kids really have redeemed Christmas for me, in part because growing up, for me, Christmas was, I had my birth mother, and then I had my mother who raised me, and then I had my father and his wife, and then whoever my mother who raised me happened to be with, and whoever my birth mother happened to be with. And so most of growing up, well, not most of growing, like 10 years of age on, it was always just like a shuffle from house to house to house. And there was none of my parents' splits were all that clean, you know? It wasn't like one of these nice divorces. And so there was a lot of contentiousness there. And so it was just like my little brother and my sister, sometimes my older brother too, but he's quite a bit older, kind of bouncing from all these different places. And it just wasn't a, it was honestly, it was awful. I didn't like it at all. And it left this kind of imprint on the holiday. And so then when Kristen and I got married, we were married, well, we were together for 3 or 4 years before we got married, and then married for about 3 or 4 years before we had Asher. And, you know, she was like, she just thought it was total Ebenezer Scrooge, you know, and just irredeemable. And then I remember probably not the first Christmas with Asher, because we were just like struggling so much just to like breathe. But by like his second Christmas and Eden's first Christmas, it was like, oh, this is cool. I like this. So but that's always been a struggle, the family piece, you know, because it's there. Others, it doesn't have to be that interpersonal. It can be, I can't get a card out in the mail.
Mine
Being
is kind
married
of
to,
go for it, Jan.
okay, being married to a pastor all these years, we never had a family Christmas unless somebody came to see us. And we had moved from, Ohio and Tennessee, where we're from. So our families were back there that far away, to Montana and then to Durango. So it was too far for them to come most of the time. Bill's parents, once they retired, I guess, they were more free to come. So if his sister wasn't going to go home and be there in our later years, they would sometimes come and be with us, but not more than a handful of times. So we were alone for really basically all holidays, and most people in our church for Christmas in particular were spending Christmas with family. So it was always just the two of us, and he had always had, like, depending on which church he was in, there were 3 Christmas Eve services. We'd get home at midnight or 1 and be exhausted. And he just needed quiet time the next day and didn't want to socialize, so we couldn't invite anybody over. And then most of our friends at church had family and had plans. So even if he had not been exhausted and wanting just to have quiet time, we couldn't invite anybody over. So we got used to just having a quiet Christmas and roasting a little stuffed chicken or something and keeping that simple. And this year was going to be my first Christmas with any member of my family in, since we got married, since maybe the year after we got married, or the year that we got married, when my parents and my sister came to see us when we were still living in Tennessee. So this year, we finally planned to go to Tennessee for Christmas, and COVID hit. So I was really looking forward to seeing the chaos and love and wonder of being back home for a Tennessee Christmas and see family.
And so once again, she's just stuck with me.
Well, last year we had Kent Nordgren over, and that was fun. He was all by himself.
Yeah.
And then we had him for Thanksgiving also. And so we have had a few times since he retired and wasn't so exhausted. I mean, maybe you all aren't as big of introverts as Bill is, but he was always in the church for every holiday, you know, pre-Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving Eve service, Christmas Eve services, Christmas morning, sometimes church if it was on Sunday, and he was at every event. So we were just focused on the church and his job.
I think the struggle of pastors' spouses is very real, and it's often not something, I think it's something that's hard for people to identify with because it is such a unique vocation. But thanks for sharing that, Jan. That is hard. Others.
I interrupted Melody.
You're good. Yeah, mine is pretty much related to family as well. I used to spend a lot of Christmases at my family's house in small town, what I used to call middle of nowhere, Kansas. So yeah, and we were non-denominational, my direct family, mom, dad, brother, and they were Catholic. So we would always go to their midnight masses and that kind of thing with them. But I always remember this feeling of kind of like shame and isolation during those services because I didn't know what was going on. And unfortunately, the attitude from a lot of my family members that were Catholic at the time was kind of like, well, you should know this. Even practices like the Lord's Prayer and that kind of thing. I just didn't have experience with it at the time because that wasn't something that we did at our churches. So I remember struggling with that quite a bit, just like feeling a little bit isolated and almost like I shouldn't be there, which is an unfortunate environment for a church. So I definitely have tried to skew the other way in my own interactions with people at the church and make sure that they feel very welcome, because I didn't at the time, and that was a big struggle for me.
Yeah. Thanks, Melody. Okay. Last question, and I hope it'll lead us into some discussion. If it doesn't, we have some fallbacks. But my last question is what, and maybe this doesn't have to be a struggle, but it could be a struggle. What questions or struggles have you had around the Christmas holiday in terms of the biblical narrative, or in terms of your faith, in terms of, it could be a theological question, it could be a scriptural question, but what has come up for you all that has been, oh, I've always wondered about that, or this has always bothered me, or?
It's really not on that way, but I have a struggle that that nativity scenes can't be put out like they used to be. Used to go, they'd be in the parks and you just look forward to seeing that, and you'd see them on all the church lawns, and it just seems that they're trying to take Christ out of Christmas.
Okay.
You should drive by the Gardella's house. They have a nativity scene out.
Yeah, they
there.
do have it out in front. I dropped something off.
We have a nativity blow up in front of our house.
Hmm.
It's surrounded by, you have to see it. Come drive by the house.
Okay.
Yeah. the nativity blow up, but then I've surrounded it by the abominable snowman from Rudolph, the Grinch, and Santa Claus and Frosty the Snowman, and they're all kind of like around the baby Jesus too. So, I married my secular with my religious, and yeah, there you go. So we have a struggle around the Christ out of Christmas, so maybe like kind of a secular Christmas versus a religious Christmas sort of deal. What other things? Yes, Ginny.
My challenge, and I have not resolved it. Every year I feel the same way, is with the commercialization of Christmas. I don't like the emphasis on everything being physical gifts to people, and the children being focused on what are they getting, and to the point where they don't even hardly look at something before they're opening the next thing, and that commercialization of Christmas is a conflict for me.
Jenny, I'm really glad I didn't answer that second question of Bo's, because I was going to say I'm always disappointed in not getting what I want. So
Oh, Brandon, you say that, and it's so funny because in our family, people ask, "What do you want?" and people will send you a link, you know, okay? And like my sister-in-law, she wants it to be a surprise, but you know, we like to get what we want, you know, like, oh God, so it's pretty bad.
and that's funny too, because I think also, I know for my parents, because I'm very difficult to gift. I don't know what I want, but they want to give me what I want, right? And this idea, and they want to give me something. So, and because they do, like out of the generosity of their heart, and they want to, I don't know, there's something about gift giving that is important. But giving a gift card every year just, defeats the purpose in a sense,
My father-in-law used to give me a gift certificate to Woodworkers Magazine. And I would spend literally dozens of hours looking through that magazine to see how I could spend his gift. I mean, that was always the highlight of the excitement of picking out something with this free gift that he has given me.
That's great. That's really cool.
It was a catalog. wasn't it?
It's nice when someone just gets you. I can say after 20 some odd years of friendship with Brendan, he's really difficult to buy for. So other
You
stuff-
don't get me, man.
No, I don't. Yeah, I try so hard. Others, a question or a struggle we have. Consumerism,
Yes.
we have kind of this secular versus religious question, but also maybe kind of a public display of religiosity question in there. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
A couple of years ago, I was the lay leader and happened to draw the assignment to read all the begats, which I tried to do it in one breath. I couldn't, but I did make it through. And in fact, several people said they appreciated my effort. It's not an easy thing to read, but I read it through, and at the end of the experience, like the next day or two, I said to myself, that was really good for me, because one thing that maybe I missed in Sunday school or sermons or whatever, that I've missed is we have all of those begats, which it appears to me link the birth of Jesus way back to David. And we have all those begats to get us from point A to point B.
Mm.
But the thing that puzzles me is we have this virgin birth. And so why are the begats important? Why were they included?
That's a really fascinating question. Yeah.
Am I the only one who worries about that?
Well, I was actually going to bring up as just a point of concern that I've had at times is that the necessity, or is there a necessity for the virgin birth? So I was going to bring that up actually as a potential, if I didn't hear from any of you on anything, I was going to bring that up as a potential concern I've had at times. I'm going to pause. I want to turn it over. Oh, Barb, did you have?
Well,
Sure.
this little book that I gave you a little highlights of it by going through the little chapter titles on this holy night. It was basically saying like the virgin birth, it was God, this Almighty was coming down to our level so that through a baby who then lived a life and he could relate to us by being, a human baby. And so that was his way of coming onto earth.
Yeah. Okay. So
Some of us have been studying the Gospel of John, which contains no information about Jesus' birth. And we asked the question of our group, would it make a difference in your faith if we knew nothing about Jesus' birth? And we all agreed that it would not change our faith at all, that it was a heartwarming story, that it had a theological message, but ultimately it was not essential to our faith in Jesus Christ as Son of God.
And that was another question I was going to bring up with, if you all hadn't asked such great questions, but it dovetails off of that, Bill, is, that Christmas has become the high and holy holiday. And yet I would feel probably very much the same if, for instance, we only had Mark and John as our New Testament Gospels, neither of which contain a birth narrative. I don't think my faith would be shaken. But if we didn't have the death and resurrection account, then I probably wouldn't, buy this storyline. Okay, so we've got a bunch of questions out there and they're all good, but I want to, Patrick's ears perked a couple times and Brendan did as well. So I want to give them an opportunity to kind of speak to what spoke to them.
Are they going to answer all those questions?
Every single one, Bill.
Okay.
And perfect. Go for Patrick.
I would love to answer all of those questions because I have answers, or I guess I have thought about those questions for a very long time. However, this is probably not the time for that because it can get very heady very quickly. I want to pose this before we go any further. Because I would challenge people to think about the incarnation, which is the fancy way of saying the birth of the divine in human form. Why the incarnation actually matters. I think it's true that in some current aspects of modern day Christianity, either people hold all about the death of Jesus, or they simultaneously talk about the life and resurrection of Jesus, and they tend to miss out on the incarnation. But I think the incarnation holds a very special place in not just the narrative of the Christian faith, but in the entire narrative of creation itself. Because there are aspects of the incarnation is not just I think that that's one good point, that God can relate to humanity, but I think that there is another aspect of it of now humanity can relate to God, and humanity can now participate with the divine on a level that this incarnation offers, that is very different and unique than any of the other aspects that we talk about, human and divine interactions. And then with that, there's also this redemption that takes place when the holy enters the unholy. There is this idea of grace and recreation that occurs in the incarnation. And those are the theological aspects of it that I think are very important when we talk about incarnation, and why they may matter to a Christian faith. It may not necessarily, not having a birth story may not necessarily matter to your faith in Jesus Christ, but I think on a deep theological level, there's a lot of good things that can come out of speaking with the incarnation, because we've actually been given the incarnation. We've been given this story, not just in Matthew, but also in Luke. And Luke's narrative is a lot. I mean, it's 100 verses compared to Matthew's, which I think is only like 36 to 50. And most of Matthew's is just the begats. But Luke has this deep story about a teenage virgin high school girl visiting her sister who's married to a priest, who then is so overwhelmed that both of them write songs about what it means to be bearers of the good news that the divine has come in the form of a child. So all of that, and none of those are great bullet points or things that you can tweet. So I'm sorry about that I just kind of threw it out there. And then last but not least, and then I'll let Brendan open up and talk a little bit more, is that the birth story from a historical perspective, and this is just my niche, like I work a lot with historical theology. From a historical perspective, the people who had importance for most of civilization, they always had some sort of birth story that connected them to something bigger and significant. So if you look at Alexander the Great, he has this coin that's made with his image on it, and on the other side of it is this god, and he was one of the guys that's called the Son of God. He's Alexander the Great, the Son of God, and his story is connected to this god that then gives him the power to bring about his empire's rule. You have the very similar thing with Caesar, as when the Romans took over different lands, they would send messengers and witnesses to the Roman Empire that would come in, and they would say, "This is the good news of our Lord and Savior, Julius Caesar." And then they would go and they would tell the birth story of Caesar and how he came from Venus, signifying that he came from a god and that he was a son of God. And so in the same sense, I think we can look at that historical nature of birth and what that means for the importance of lordship, and see that Matthew and Luke are attempting to redefine that narrative of birth and divineship and authority in their interpretation and their version of who Jesus of Nazareth is, which then lays the way for the justifications of his life and his sermons, his actions, his death on the cross, and then the resurrection, which is him being crowned in his true glory. So to me, I see that there's a lot of significance to the birth story from a historical perspective and then also from a theological perspective. And now I'll shut up because I've talked for long enough. Thank you.
Brendan, thoughts?
That's good. I'd like to hear if anybody has any bounce back on that. It'd be great to hear as well.
I would say I did a series last year, and I do believe this, that there are 3 theological points that if the church were to re-engage and reimagine and more fully understand, I think it would make a lot of difference. One of which is the incarnation. And Patrick, you actually came during that season and preached for me, and you preached on either the incarnation or the Trinity, which was the other theological piece, and I shouldn't say or, and the atonement. So I'm deeply committed to teaching the significance of the incarnation, birth story or no. But I should also say I loved preaching that 3-part series. I don't know that the congregation loved me preaching that 3-part series.
Danny just has a smirk on. I don't know what.
Fun. But sometimes you're preaching and you're having a lot of fun and nobody else is. It happens.
Patrick said the phrase divine in the form of a child. And I was raised Lutheran. And so every week I would recite, and sometimes multiple times a week, because I also went to Lutheran school, I would recite the Nicene Creed, no, the Apostles' Creed. I think that's it. Maybe it was the Nicene, no, the shorter one. I think it's the Apostles' Creed.
Yeah, that's the Apostles' Creed.
And I think the Nicene actually makes this move as well, but it moves from when we start talking about Jesus, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, was buried, on the 3rd day resurrected. And it struck me, I'm in my 40s now, I know you can't tell that, but and I was reciting this to one of my classes maybe a year ago, and all of a sudden I realized we lopped off a huge portion, like a significant portion of the Gospels. So yeah, born of the Virgin Mary, important, but we don't talk about, and this is God who is like a child, who, if orthodoxy, if we adhere to orthodoxy, who decided to become the most vulnerable and needy being that you can be, right? That's mind-blowing. That in and of itself, that decision to empty the self of potential power and rely completely 100% on others is phenomenal. And so, yeah, I agree with Patrick insofar as God relates to people in that process, humanity relates to God as one who chooses to become vulnerable with humanity. The genealogies, I think it's so important. Cheryl, you said you were reading. I had to think of what you were talking about with the begats. But that's the genealogy, right? I'm from Indiana, so I'm not very cultured. But I looked this up recently. I don't believe that it is in any of the lectionaries or any of the 3-year cycles of the lectionaries, even for the Advent season. I could be wrong. Pastors, is that right or wrong? Right.
That is correct.
Why? Because it's hard. But there's such a message in those genealogies. There's 2. There's Luke and there's Matthew. And if you read them together, they don't correspond. And people have tried to say, well, one is Joseph's family, one is Mary's family. It doesn't work out that way. And if we get so wrapped up in is it historical or not, we lose the deeper message, which I think to the point, was it Cheryl who was bringing up the virgin birth, which is a great question. It's like, what does it mean to be part of the family?
Yeah.
And I think of the phrase, right? Blood is thicker than water. And I've always understood that as like the blood of the family is thicker than whatever water does. I've recently learned it's the water of childbirth, right? And so it's blood as in non-relationship, like oath-taking is thicker than actual genetic relationship. Am I right on that?
Could
yeah,
be.
okay, thanks, Melody. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that's right. And that's the story of the entire Hebrew Bible into the advent of Jesus, which is, and Paul even brings it up in Galatians and Colossians about the family of God, that family transcends genealogy or transcends bloodline. And so we can talk about, and then I'll shut up, but Matthew begins with Abraham and Luke ends or begins with Adam, right? And so in one sense, Matthew is being exclusive. It's the Jewish people out of whom Jesus comes. And Luke is being inclusive, where Jesus is the heir of humanity, right? And at the same time, then if you go back to the exclusive narrative or the genealogy of Matthew, this is phenomenal. You have 3 women included, which not only breaks the whole paradigm in and of itself, but the 3 women are the outsiders. It's Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute.
Prostitute, yeah.
Yeah. And the Canaanite, you can't get worse, right? You know. And then you have Tamar, who engaged in what might be considered some nefarious activities, although she had to set Judah straight. And then, of course, Ruth, who's a Moabite, who's also a traditional enemy of Israel. And so who is Jesus' family? It's 3 women of ill repute, perhaps of foreign bloodline, of bad religious practices. That's who Jesus' line is. Can you imagine how church would function differently if we focused on those genealogies now and again? Full stop. I feel like I'm giving a
pen, like a mic drop. Did you just drop your pen like a mic drop?
members of the jury. I bid you to consider.
Did you really just do that? Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Brendan. Kind of, because I'm seeing some threads coming together here. I'm wondering about, because speaking of genealogy, the genealogy, I think of the story of the man.
I'm sorry, but can I say one more thing? Sorry. That's what that's what kind of turned my mind onto that. Patrick saying that Jesus' birth line flipped or subverted the narrative of who the worthy person is, right? Jesus' bloodline, he does include kings, David, for example, and other kings to the Judahite line. But man, it includes some not so good people in that. Okay, sorry, Bo.
No, that's fine. And it is exactly what I was tying into. Although, thanks, Melody, because I have been using that phrase, blood is thicker than water. I've never actually used that phrase, but I've heard people use that phrase toward me, and they use it completely the wrong way. Like completely the opposite of what it actually means. That's interesting. Because you're right, Brendan. Yeah, wow. I did not know that. But I'm thinking about that kind of, well, just the inclusivity of the genealogy, the inclusivity of the birth narrative, that, you know, that you have the first people that hear the news are shepherds, you know, second in line, though they come several years later, are Gentiles, clearly. So there's that piece that I wouldn't mind talking about further. But then one of the questions that came up that I think is a really interesting question, and Patrick, you were bringing up something earlier this afternoon about this, and that is kind of this public display of religiosity. And I think someone had mentioned they missed the nativity scenes, and I'm curious around, like, how do we as Christians interact with the world around us, knowing that there is a very secular Christmas that perhaps we participate in so much that we are complicit, or are missing major pieces of the significance of these birth narratives and what they're actually saying. And I kind of wanted to explore that a little bit further, because and I guess a part of the reason is on the one hand, I don't want to be the Christian that gets upset about the Starbucks holiday cup this year. But I have Christian friends or acquaintances or friends too, that's how they feel like they're taking a stand for the true meaning of Christmas is by, disliking Starbucks holiday cup this year because it's not religious enough, or I don't even know what they did last year. I think it was just red, and I saw all of a group of friends of mine get really upset. And I just thought, I thought that can't possibly be the way that I'm supposed to reintroduce Christ into Christmas. Patrick, I was pointing at you. You can't tell. I'm pointing at you on my screen. I don't know how Zoom works. You're on mute, though, I think.
Clearly, I don't know how Zoom works either, and it's been almost a year. I think it's interesting that in just our conversation, I would say many of us are coming from a very similar perspective in this chat, and yet we have somebody who is saying, I really dislike the secularism of Christmas that's going on. And then we have another person who said, yeah, we were talking with our group and we agreed that without the birth narrative, we'd still have our faith in Christ. I think that right there shows that the reason why Christmas has become so secular, I think would be in part because of our lack of understanding of the narrative that is the birth of Christ. I think that we have done that because we've so placated to this emotional perspective of a feel-good Jesus narrative where we have our baby Jesus wrapped in a golden diaper, right? And it's the time where we get to feel good.
There are only 3 people in this Zoom conversation that understand that reference.
I know, I'm sorry. But like there's this sense where we have wanted Christmas to feel good and we've wanted Jesus to feel good. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I'm not saying that that's bad, but I think in so doing that, it has created space for the secularism of Christmas to enter into our expressions of Christmas, both as a people, as churches, and because really, I think you said this already, Bo, that there is some violence in these narratives. Like there's Herod getting angry and upset and throwing a temper tantrum, which results in killing of babies. We don't have any songs that sing about that I know of, or Christmas carols that we bring up during Christmas that talk about that.
Wait, Brendan,
right?
No, we don't. But the point is well made, right? Like whitewashing.
You're thinking.
Well, like we don't talk about the fact that Joseph was afraid to marry, to be wedded to Mary because she was viewed as an adulterer, and we all know what happened to adulterers back then, because she was pregnant. And so like this is there's scandal in this story, there's violence in this story. We tend not to read Mary's song of insurrection until like the middle of January, when we're all pretty much fed up and angry and cold and bitter to begin with. We don't read that during Christmas, even though that song of insurrection happens prior to the birth of Jesus. So I would say that the story of Christmas is in one sense beautiful and emotional and heartwarming, and should allow us to celebrate that. but then simultaneously the story of Christmas is rich and dark and filled with a revolution that is not just taking place in a historical moment, but is taking place throughout the universe and throughout time. And it's a testament that the systems that oppress and the system that has your boot on your neck is not eternal, but the system of the divine, which goes all the way back to Abraham and the stories that we hear in Abraham of Hagar, right? Who calls God the one who hears her, because Hagar's being oppressed by Sarah. And God comes and talks to her and gives her a story and gives her a life. And she calls him the God who hears. And then we talk about Egypt and the God who sees the flight and the oppression of the individuals. And then we have this woman of this mother of Jesus, who is Mary, who's associated with Miriam. And then we read Miriam's song about when the people of Israel passed through Egypt. And again and again and again, like I think that this story connects the Old Testament, the Hebrew narratives, with our stories now, and should lead us to a recognition that the Christmas story should be one that calls us to speak out against the injustices of this world. And I'm not talking about like the injustices that you and I experience, because I will be the first to say, like, I'm white, male, and middle class. So I don't experience the same type of oppression that even the women on this chat have experienced. I don't experience that same type of injustice that people who live in a poor town experience. I don't experience the types of injustice that 90% of the world's population experience on a regular basis. I recognize that. But this Christmas story is based in a people who experience oppression not just in a day, but experience oppression through generations. It's based in a land that's not a little town of Bethlehem. It's in a piece of property that has been fought over for a millennium, starting with the Egyptians, going into the Canaanites, then the Philistines, then the Israelites, then the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks. And then the story picks up in the Romans, with the Romans trying to oppress them. But then you can continue on after the Romans, and you can talk about Egypt once again. You can talk about America. You can talk about the Israelis with the Palestinians. It is wrought in a land that has seen oppression and that has seen systemic injustices take place upon people. And that's what the story should draw our attention to. And so I think that if we could recover a little bit of that uncomfortableness in the story, we'd have better grounds to say, let's put Christ back in Christmas, by recognizing what Christ is actually calling us to do and a people to be.
Thanks,
I
Ben.
wish that I had a pencil to throw down. I don't know.
Perfect. Perfect. And you could add, I mean, you're making these parallels. Even you brought up the Herod's murder of children. Obviously, the parallel, of course, is in Egypt again, with the Pharaoh murdering the male Israelite.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, there's so many parallels in this story to the larger narrative that's taking place in Scripture. But I mean, it takes time to unpack that. Like, it's not just a quick little nativity. It's a huge story that is passed down and goes beyond just our limited perspective.
Go ahead, Brendan.
And it's cast in an intentional way.
Right.
We can't assume that the authors didn't know what they were doing in making these parallels.
So I guess the question that comes up for me then is, I learned very recently that a part of the celebratory nature of Advent and Christmas comes from one of my all-time favorite people, Saint Francis of Assisi. And I didn't know that little bit of history, and perhaps some of you did. I knew that historically Advent was always a fasting season, and then it became a feasting season. But I didn't know the history behind that, and that part of that, or that comes from Saint Francis. About 800 years ago, he was so thrilled about the incarnation that he thought, surely we need to be feasting during this time and not fasting. And so the impetus for kind of, even he put lights in the trees and stuff, and he was such a he's so into creation. He put lights in the trees to show that the trees already had light in them. They already had the light of God in them. And so a lot of these traditions that come down to us started from, a contemplative monk who was thrilled about the incarnation, which is maybe the exact thing that we've lost in all of this. From a pastor leading a church's perspective, I did a series called, I think I was telling you guys earlier, I did a series called, I think it was called like Advent Uprising or something like that. And I was sharing with Patrick and Brendan earlier, basically my whole thesis for the Advent series was, if you read Matthew chapters 1 and 2 and you're not really irritated and disgusted by the end, then you haven't read it, because there's displacement, there are refugees, there's an infanticide, there's a forced state census. I mean, it's like just one thing after the next. It's such devastating news to bring about the incarnation. But it all, in some ways, as Patrick was alluding to earlier, it speaks almost in direct contrast to the birth stories of other powers that be. Jesus is not like a Caesar. Jesus is not like Alexander the Great. But I worry as a pastor, to challenge the placidness of the Christian Christmas. That's a big deal. You don't want to, it's not something that you easily trifle with, because these traditions, though they may be even far removed from where they started 800 years ago with St. Francis, these traditions are so embedded that it's like, I did have Cheryl read the genealogy one year, even though it's not a lectionary reading, because it's an important reading. But you mess with these things, and it's like, don't mess with my Christmas. So I'm curious to hear from people in the group, like, how much could I mess with Christmas before you'd get really irritated with me?
One quick observation, it is
Leaves the room. I'm sure that's not why, but that was funny.
It's ironic to the conversation that it was Francis who introduced these traditions, who himself gave up great wealth and privilege, and only then was able to see joy in the incarnation.
Yeah, I was thinking, so just with that, and I know, Bo, you want to know from your congregation how much you can mess up with Christmas before they, like, you're looking for job security. I get that, but maybe this is not the audience.
I don't know if I'm looking for job security.
I think so. Francis found his joy in the incarnation when he picked up Saint Athanasius's book on the incarnation, which is a short little read. I mean, I think it's like 70 pages total, and you can get it in English, so you don't have to read it in its original Latin form. And I would encourage everybody to read that, really, because it's this beautiful text that talks about, in the midst of our spiral into despair and destruction, the holy divine God chose to come down into human form in order to pull us up out of our like cyclical sinful behavior. Like that's how it starts, and you're just like, okay, like that excites me right there. That's exciting. That's the power of the incarnation. But then you have, like, I think there's still a lot of joy. Like there's all this stuff that is going on with Christmas and with the incarnation, but then there's joy. Like Mary's song, the Magnificat, like I'm reading it right now. And she begins with, my soul glorifies the Lord and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things for me. Holy is his name. And then it talks about like how his mercy extends to those who fear him. And it talks about how he's brought down the rulers of the thrones that have oppressed us and has lifted up the humble and the meek, and has filled the hungry with good things and has sent the rich away empty. I mean, like there is this joy that's found in Mary's song because of the incarnation. And I think that like we as people are living in this tension of where we don't know what it's like to be hungry. We don't know what it's like to be in want. Many of us, I would say many of us right now don't necessarily know that feeling, but there are many who do, and they can teach us that. And not only that, there are many of us who have experienced trials and hardships and have been grateful when we have messed up, and there have been people who have been merciful towards us. And I think those are the types of memories that we can hearken back to when we talk about all the other stuff that happens within this birth story, because it creates a levels of true joy that are not found in our consumerism, or that are not found in our lights or our Christmas songs, but are actually found in what it means to be authentically human, which is ironic because I think that's what the incarnation teaches us, is that to be authentically human is in fact to participate with the divine.
So I'm still curious about my question.
Well, oh,
Ask the questions before Patrick says, before I threaten my own job security. No.
This is tangential to your question, but you know that there are literally dozens of people who come to the Christmas Eve service who don't come throughout the year. And I'm not talking about family that's visiting. I'm talking about people from the neighborhood, people you see again and again. There is something in that Christmas story that draws them. It may in part be tradition. We've always done this, but I think there's more than that. You know, I watched them take communion. And I've talked to them enough to know that there is something there in that story that pulls them in. And I think that's something that we need to celebrate. Sometimes we demeaningly talk about Christmas and Easter Christians, but there's something in those stories that pulls people in, even people who live mostly secular lives.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Bill. I think that's a part of why I think I'm passionate about the church understanding the theology of the incarnation and the theology of the atonement. In part, it's not just to edify the church, but it is evangelical for me. I think if we understood these things, and I throw in the Trinity as well, which I happen to be preaching on this Sunday, Advent, I do think there's something so compelling, and I do think that there's some kind of Holy Spirit. I almost think of it as like a ripple effect, you know, like the wave of the ripple of the Spirit hits at these 2 times of year, and it happens to be Christmas and Easter, whether that corresponds with the actual time of year that Jesus was born and the actual time of year he was crucified seems completely irrelevant. It's like the wave of the ripple hits at those 2 particular times. And my observation has been, it's not just tradition, or this is what we've always done before, that brings people through the doors on Christmas Eve and Easter. Maybe in some part that explains it, but it certainly doesn't explain all of it. So yeah, I would agree with you there wholeheartedly. One thing that a church that I served in the past did that I thought was interesting, because it didn't mess with the Christmas service so much or mess with the Advent. I do have to tell you before I say that, I and Melody knows this, I basically told Tom and Melody and Robin, you just carol the whole way through Advent in COVID. We are not beholden, other than O Come Emmanuel and Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, we are not beholden to Advent carols in this season, because nobody needs to hear the drudgery of Advent hymns in the midst of COVID-19. And if you look at the Presbyterian hymnal, I don't know about Lutheran hymnals or Nazarene hymnals, but our Advent hymns are dirges. I mean, it is like wah, wah to the nth degree. So I did tell them, go ahead and carol all the way through Advent, which I think our congregation probably appreciates because they don't really know the Advent hymns anyways. And they don't like them because they're all kind of downers.
Bo.
Yeah.
Lutherans invented the dirge.
Did they? Were you a part of that committee?
No, it was long before me.
That, anyways, I couldn't resist. So back to this church that I served prior in San Luis Obispo, they didn't mess with anything, but they did have a separate blue Christmas service. Has anybody ever attended a church that had a blue Christmas service? And it was kind of, I mean, in a sense, it was designed for, yeah.
We weren't allowed to have colors in our services as a Lutheran.
Lutherans. Everything is black and white.
Yes.
Gray. And gray. And gray tones. But part of what I appreciated about the service, it was designed for people who get depressed in the Christmas season, which I certainly can resonate with for reasons I shared much earlier. Christmas has not always been a happy season in my life, but what I liked also about it was it held in balance kind of the things that we're talking about now, of it's not all rainbows and sunshine at Christmas. And that's not, and what I liked about the service that they had at least was it acknowledged that not only do you feel this way, but this is actually a part of the Christmas season. You know, Mary, the mother of Jesus, the most common name in the first century, means bitter, because everybody's unhappy and they're waiting on this Savior. Anyways, that's one way I've thought about adding something to our Christmas season, but I still am curious about how much could I mess with the actual Christmas Eve service before I really irritated people.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question. I have a lot of reasons not to answer the question. However, quite a number of years ago, some committee, I wasn't on the committee, or some group in the church decided to create all of those symbols out of styrofoam
Mm.
that then decorated the church and has for years and years and years. And when it first happened, it was, I can't even remember, but it's been a long time. I think it was probably before Bill. I'm not sure, but
No,
it
I
was a
remember
long time ago.
those, the
And
Christmas.
Yeah.
did you do did you do the symbols?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Anyway, it's still quite a while ago. But what I really appreciated about it was it offered me, and I think most of us, the opportunity to learn some things about the Christmas holiday season and connect that to the real meaning of Christmas, the biblical accounts and the historical significance of various shapes. And so I found that to be very meaningful. I thought it added a lot to the service without it being overtly challenging and taking something apart in order to put that in. It just added richness. And so I appreciated that.
No, thanks for sharing that, Cheryl. Well,
I think just tapping in with what Cheryl said, I think that is really interesting, because I have been, I mean, no, we all know I love to like show up and say, what do you think? All right, let me blow that up. And I really don't want to do that here, because I think that there is a really good understanding of taking all of the positive notes on Christmas and combining it with just the other aspect that we have done such a good job of hiding throughout, a couple generations. And I think that if we can blend the two, that then there is a level of like true joy that can happen from this. Like that's the beauty of the dirges that come from Advent, is that when you're singing these songs that are like not inspirational by any means for 4 Sundays in a row, and then you hit that Christmas Eve service and you start singing these happy, lively, jingling songs, it actually is like, it creates a wave of overwhelming joy, which I think is what we're trying to get at, is that the incarnation, even in the midst of like utter despair, brings about this spirit of rejoicing and overwhelming gratitude. And so I think that like, if you're going to mess with Christmas, the only thing would be is to not get rid of anything, but then just to add all these other underbelly things that we've been talking about to the joy and the thankfulness and the happiness and the celebration that is Christmas.
Well, I really appreciate that, Patrick, because I think as you guys were talking and sharing, I'm always trying to think of, what tools can I give to my congregation, and then, what tools can Christianity offer the world? And something that seems to be missing to me, both from the church and from the world, but is clearly embedded in the tradition of the church, is nuance and kind of the tapestry of life and juxtaposition, and Christmas is all of those things. It's got all of these things. They're all happening at once. Mary's song sits side by side with the fact that she can't find a place to stay. It's all in there. And maybe, like Cheryl's saying, the idea that the church can just wrestle with the nuances, that it is a complex picture that's being painted, and you can't just say it's one thing or the other. I think we have mistakenly erred too far in the direction of this is all just a great, joyous Santa Claus reindeer thing. But the solution is probably not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there's your tool for this evening is let it be complex, because it is. And life is complex too. So, you know, we're already used to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well,
It's true.
we're coming up on 8:30, which is almost my bedtime. And it's 30 minutes past Brendan's. So any other thoughts or questions or ideas? Or I know we didn't hit on everybody's questions. You guys had really good questions. I really liked them. All right.
Can I close with a benediction?
I would love that.
All right. This is one of the benedictions that I love to use during this Christmas tide period. So, see this. May something new be birthed for you and in you. May this season bring about an imagination to participate in something new. May you learn the language of the holy that breeds hope and laughter for those who only want to offer cynicism and despair. And may grace and peace be with you all.
Amen.
Amen.
And
Thanks, Patrick. That was perfect.
yep.
Everybody have a wonderful evening. I'm so glad you were here, and we'll do another one of these in January, I think, and we'll keep you posted, and we'll let you know much further ahead of time. So thank you for letting us do this last minute. It was a lot of fun, and I really liked everybody being here. And I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thanks.
Wonderful night.